Hi everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and today's contract tip has to do with writing special stipulations. So I'm going to talk about writing special stipulations, what you think they mean, what they may actually mean, and what the GAR, Georgia Association of Realtors contract has to say about special stipulations, and some tips and tricks at the end. So stay tuned to the end of what you can do to actually make sure your special stipulations have the effect that you think they are going to have to protect your client for whom you are writing those special stipulations. So in the GAR contract, in the special stipulations, in the GAR purchase and sale agreement, there is a place at the end to write a special stipulation. If you have ever watched any of my videos or taken any of my CE classes, you will repeatedly have heard me say, don't do them. Please try to limit your special stipulations as much as possible, number one. Number two, never write a special stipulation addressing a contract issue that has already been addressed elsewhere in the purchase and sale agreement in and of itself or in an exhibit. And I'll tell you why in just a minute. The issue is if you do have to write a special stipulation, you want to make sure that it does have the contractual impact for the benefit of your client for whom you are writing it that you think it is going to have, and not actually negate that based on the lack of information or the lack of totality or completion with which you write that stipulation. So let's start at the beginning. A special stipulation, the terms of a special stipulation are going to supersede or take precedence or control over an exhibit, and the information in an exhibit is going to control or take precedence or supersede over information that is pre-printed in the contract. So there's the order of what controls or what the parties are held to based on where it appears in the contract. The issue is, what happens when you write a special stipulation, but the parties don't adhere to it? They agree to it in a contract and you sign, you have a binding contract with that special stip, but the parties don't do it. What happens if you get to the end of a contract and you get right before a closing and the party hasn't done that? Can the other party terminate? Is that considered a breach of contract? Is that breach considered a default of the contract? What's the remedy for that contractual breach? What did you write? What did you mean? All those kinds of issues. So again, we already mentioned, do not write a special stipulation for an issue that has already been addressed. And the reason I say that, based on the order, that just is contractually speaking the order, but GAR, Georgia Association of Realtors, has actually added a paragraph in the 2022 purchase and sale agreement that just explains this out for clarification for agents and for the public. And it is in paragraph C4L, rules for interpreting this agreement, and it just goes through that order of what controls or takes precedence or is binding upon the parties. And you start with the actual printed, then handwritten, then exhibits, and then special stipulations. The next issue I want to address is also spelled out in the GAR, Georgia Association of Realtors purchase and sale agreement. And this is, what is the effect of a special stipulation in a purchase and sale contract on the parties? And this is spelled out in paragraph B10C under the brokerage section. And it specifically states that if a broker has written any special stipulation herein, the party for whom such special stipulations were written, A, confirms that each special stip actually does reflect the party's complete understanding as to the substance and form of the special stipulation. B, hereby adopts each special stipulation as the original work of the party. And C, hereby agrees to indemnify and hold the broker who prepared the special stipulation harmless from any and all claims, causes of action, suits, and damages arising out of or relating to such special stipulation. So basically, the public person needs to understand what that special stipulation is, and that it does, in essence, reflect what it is that they think that it should reflect. They also agree to hold the broker harmless, and then the issue is, what is the intent and what is the effect of that special stipulation? And even GAR, even the Georgia Association of Realtors themselves, state that regardless of the intent of the parties, the courts in Georgia may rule completely differently than what you thought it was that you were writing. And that this is in paragraph CG in the GAR Purchase and Sale Agreement under the section GAR Forms, and it specifically states, if any party has any questions about his or her rights and obligations under any GAR form, he or she should consult an attorney. Provisions in the GAR forms are subject to differing interpretations by our courts other than what the parties may have intended. At times, our courts may strike down or not enforce provisions in our GAR forms as written. No representation made that the GAR that the GAR forms will protect the interests of any particular party or will be fit for any specific purpose. So there's that other issue that regardless of what the intent is of the parties, that also could be an issue that the courts might disagree with. So let me give you a specific example of what I'm talking about, and then let me give you some points of practice to avoid any issues that would negatively impact your clients. So let's say you have a contract and there is a special stipulation that says at closing, property to be clean and free of debris, professionally cleaned, broom swept, free of debris, and professionally cleaned by professional cleaner. I guess that's what professionally cleaned means, with a receipt given to buyer. And let's say that's all the special stipulation says. Well, let's say the buyer goes final walkthrough and the seller had it professionally cleaned. They have a receipt. They give it to the buyer goes and does their final walkthrough, and the professional cleaners missed something in the house. They didn't clean it, or it's not clean to the buyer's satisfaction. So the buyer's agent contacts the listing agent hours before closing and says, hey, we just did a walkthrough and this property is not clean to the buyer's satisfaction. Well, what happens? Is there a breach? Is that meeting the term? Did the seller meet the terms of the special stipulation? Does that contractual breach constitute enough of a material breach? Does the buyer have termination rights? Is that considered a default? There's all kinds of issues left unanswered because that special stipulation was, number one, vague, and number two, did override something that was already in the contract. So in the GAR contract in and of itself, under paragraph C3, where it talks about risk of damage to the property, it does specifically state that the seller shall deliver the property clean and free of trash, debris, and personal property that the seller has not identified as remaining with the property. So that's one thing to consider. So we have a special stipulation that is addressing that, but it is going on more than that, stating that they wanted the property cleaned by a professional cleaner with a copy of the receipt. Now, that's all the special stipulation said. The buyer did the walkthrough before closing and said it was not cleaned to their satisfaction. Well, where in that special stipulation did it say anything about buyer satisfaction? How can you determine what the buyer's satisfaction is? And the seller did provide a receipt, and it was professionally cleaned. So did the seller meet the terms of that special stipulation? One argument is yes, absolutely. I can't help it that the cleaners didn't do their job. You didn't pick out the cleaners, buyer. You told me to have it professionally cleaned, which I did. Here's the receipt. I met the terms of the contract. I'm obligated to go to closing. Let's say the buyer didn't do that. Let's say the seller didn't do that. Does that constitute a breach of the contract? Perhaps. Is that breach, however, of enough of a material nature that constitutes a default? And what is the remedy for that default? Well, in the GAR contract, it does talk about default of the buyer and of the seller. But the issue is, there are different types of breaches of a contract. There's a minor breach of contract. There's a material breach of contract. There's an actual breach of contract. And there's an anticipatory breach of contract. The question is, what type of a breach was that, if it was a breach? And number two, does that breach, is the remedy for that breach necessarily termination rights on behalf of the buyer where they're protected to get their earnest money back? Guess what? That would be up to a judge to decide, and we don't want to let it be in a judge's hands. So what do you do as a real estate agent to prevent these issues and all this ambiguity and turning a happy situation, buying and selling a house, into a contentious situation right before closing? Well, a couple of things. Number one, whenever it is that you are writing a special stipulation, number one, first see if there is a need to write it. Number two, you will want to get with a broker or an attorney to help you write that special stipulation. Number three, you want to make sure that when you are creating a special stipulation, you make sure that you include in that special stipulation how you can tell when it has been achieved or not achieved, typically by a third-party neutral person. In other words, you don't use words like to the satisfaction of the buyer. You would also provide for some sort of terms of notice if that was or was not achieved. And you want to limit the time frame. You don't want to leave it up to the day of closing or hours before closing. You would want to say to have it professionally cleaned within 3 days of closing, receipts provided, so forth and so on. Something like that, you're still going to run into issues, because if the seller hasn't vacated the house and they haven't professionally cleaned, it could still get dirty. So what is an even better way to handle it? Before I get to the better way to handle it, you also want to include potential consequences for lack of performance of that special stipulation. So in that special stipulation, seller to have house professionally cleaned and provide receipts to buyer 2 days prior to closing, 24 hours prior to closing, something like that. And then you would say, should this not be done, buyer reserves right to declare contract null and void with full refund of earnest money, or deduct X amount of dollars from seller's proceeds at cleaning, payable to blah, blah, blah vendor to have the work done. So, agents, what is the best way to handle special stipulations for something like this? Having the house cleaned, repairs, something, and so forth. Well, generally speaking, when you're dealing with something that calls for an opinion, the quality of repairs, receipts that go with any repair issues, warranties that go with any of that, choosing who is going to perform the work, whether it be a cleaning company, cleaning agency, a repair company, so forth and so on. Probably the better way to handle it would be to have the party that wants that work done be in charge of having that work done. So instead of relying on, for example, in this situation, instead of relying on having the seller choose a cleaning company, having it done, paying for it, having the receipt, so forth and so on, a better way would probably be to contract for the seller to pay for it out of the seller's proceeds at closing, and have the buyer actually hire the vendor that's going to do that work. So the special stipulation I ask you to consider would be, at closing, from seller's proceeds. Seller to pay, name of vendor, X amount of dollars for house to be professionally cleaned. That way, at closing, the seller doesn't have to pay for it out of pocket. At closing from the seller's proceeds, the closing attorney is going to cut a check payable to the vendor of buyer's choice, hand that check to the buyer. Then when the buyer owns the house, the buyer then can contact that vendor, in this example, a house cleaner, schedule the work when they want it done. They're in charge of that. They'll get the receipt, and they can add on to whatever financial amount the seller has they've negotiated. And it's all in the buyer's hands that can have it done before they move in, on their schedule, so forth and so on. And then you don't have to rely on anybody's definition of satisfaction or a cleaning company that you may not have chosen, that the seller may have chosen. And this does not impact the buyer's loan because it is not a concession from a seller to the buyer. It is money going directly from the seller to a vendor. Hope this contract tip helped you out. Thank you so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education. If you like that video, check out the one here. If you like the content on this entire channel, please click here to subscribe. I try to take even the most complicated of real estate situations and make them crystal clear. See what I did there? Real estate made crystal clear. Thank you guys so much for watching. I am Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.